Greetings everyone, I am Dr. Samidhi Navaratna and I am delighted to be your guide on this introductory lecture on medical research. Whether you are a medical student, a healthcare professional or simply intrigued by medical research, I do hope this lecture will ignite your passion for evidence-based medicine and inspire you to contribute to the advancement of healthcare through research. So let's move on to the lecture per se. So in this slide, I have listed the learning outcomes. By the end of the lecture, the student should be able to define medical research, describe the basic concepts of evidence-based practice, including evidence-based medicine, then state the purposes of conducting medical or healthcare research and classify types of medical research. Then state the stages and steps in the. So I have picked this quote from one of the WHO online documents. Right, here's the source, and it says, I quote, in college, the teaching of community medicine had been boring, but now it seems exceptionally relevant. So this is the experience of a young doctor in a primary health care situation, as visualized by Taylor et al. In 1984. So I do hope the perception of the relevance of community medicine as a subject, has changed for you also over time. Well, the teaching of community medicine might have felt boring or disconnected from your interests and aspirations during your undergraduate time. At that stage, students often focus on the core subjects of their chosen fields or subjects with more hands-on experience and clinical exposure. Community medicine may not have seemed as exciting or directly applicable compared to the more hands-on and clinically oriented subjects, as I said. So furthermore, community medicine primarily, focuses on public health, preventive medicine and health of the communities at large. So this broader perspective might not have been immediately evident in its importance when you were focused on mastering the foundational knowledge and skills required for clinical practice. So I hope as time has passed and you are possibly gained more exposure to the real world healthcare environment, your perspective might have shifted. I suppose the reasons being, the pandemic exposure. For an example, the experience you had with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the impact of that on you and the public at large may have been a reason for your shift. So understanding, many other things that community medicine contribute to, like from understanding the social determinants of health, its focus on preventive medicine, particularly, this is the subject where you learn all about the prevention, and as we know, prevention is always better than cure. And so then other things like understanding the global burden of diseases, community-based care, epidemiology. What epidemiology is? That is the study of distribution, patterns and determinants of various diseases and applying that knowledge to combat those diseases. So, and even in advocacy and policy planning and health systems development, then other things like so many other things are there, like health education, making the public aware of certain things. So there are so many things that I may not have listed, but community medicine as a subject, you must be feeling now that it's really, really important. And, when you think of research, so research and community medicine is always intertwined. So what we are going to talk in this lecture will be really, really relevant to you in this, in covering these aspects. So before we dive into the intricacies of medical research, let's explore the significance of evidence-based practice. So together we'll, uncover how research empowers medical professionals to make better informed decisions for optimal patient care. Right, so this is a diagram I have taken from my own book, An Introduction to Systematic Reviews in Healthcare. And as you can see, for optimal patient care, we need the evidence-based practice, and the elements of evidence-based practice includes the integration of best available evidence, the best available external evidence, clinical expertise, and patient values and circumstances related to patient and client management, practice management, and health policy decision making. So all these three elements are equally important in evidence-based practice. So a couple of more important facts. Healthcare decisions and policies must be based on evidence-based practice. Okay, so as professionals, as healthcare professionals, or as budding healthcare professionals, you need to keep that in mind. And be this evidence-based practice, be evidence-based medicine or evidence-based nursing, it's the same. And when we think of the hierarchy of the researchers, the systematic reviews are considered as the gold standard for evidence-based practice. We'll be discussing about that also in a later slide. So what is medical or clinical research? As you know, most of today's recommendations and guidelines for medical treatment and even diagnosis stem from research. So research, as you know, can be defined as a systematic collection, analysis and interpretation of data to answer a certain question or solve a problem. So it's a scientific approach to answering a research question. I have a separate lecture on how you translate a clinical scenario into a researchable research question. So please go through that video if you want more about more information about this. So it's a scientific approach, as I said, and solving a research problem. There are so many steps you need to adhere to. Please go through that lecture too. So what is medical or clinical research? Clinical or medical research is a component of research intended to produce knowledge valuable for understanding human disease, preventing and treating illness, and promoting health. So this is the definition. So this is, in 1997, the NIH Directors Panel on Clinical Research, that is NIH stand for National Institute of Health, issued this three-part definition of clinical research. Okay, firstly, patient-oriented research. So in this sense, research conducted with human subjects or on material of human origin, such as tissues, specimens, and cognitive phenomena, for which an investigator directly interacts with a human subject, okay, or human subjects. So this excluded from this definition are in vitro studies that utilize human tissues that cannot be linked to a living individual. So for like forensic samples, you can't treat them as patient-oriented research. If you're doing a research, taken from a dead person. So patient-oriented research includes mechanisms of human disease, therapeutic interventions, clinical trials, and development of new technologies. So then you have the epidemiologic and behavioral studies, and then you have the outcomes research and health services research. So this is also taken from this online source. So let's understand the scope of medical research. As you know, medical research encompasses a continuum of studies involving interactions with patients, diagnostic clinical materials or data or populations. And this research can be categorized under various topics like disease mechanisms, where you study the etiopathogenesis of diseases, and bidirectional integrative research, that is also known as translational research, which means that you take the scientific findings of research and translates them into real-world applications that can be used to improve healthcare. And then you have research on clinical knowledge, detection, diagnosis, and natural history of diseases. Then therapeutic interventions, including development and clinical trials of drugs, devices, and instruments. Then you have preventive studies, preventive researchers, and research on health promotion. Then behavioral research, health services research, including outcomes and cost effectiveness. Then there are epidemiological studies, then community-based and care-based trials. So before you embark on a research, it's really essential that you understand the characteristics of research. So research requires a clear statement of the problem, and it requires a well-defined purpose or a goal. A research is built on previous knowledge of the subject. Okay, you are not starting afresh or new, so it's always a continuation from the existing knowledge. Requires an appropriate method and design, so you need to have good methodologies involved. Requires a plan, and research gives useful and valid findings. Then the research should focus on priority problems, so that is where a needs assessment comes in. Be systematic, so there should be a protocol and you should stick to it so that anybody who takes over can continue also. Be logical, be reductive, be replicable, be generative, be action oriented, follow an integrated multidisciplinary approach, be participatory, be relatively simple, timely and time-bound, employing a comparatively simple design, be as much cost-effective as possible, and be presented in formats most useful for administrators, decision makers, business managers, or community members. So this flow chart gives you the classification of medical research. This is a simple version. So medical research can be either experimental or observational. Then the observational studies are of two types: descriptive observational studies and analytical observational studies. So under descriptive studies, you get the correlation studies, case reports, case series, and follow-up studies. Whereas for the analytical arm, you have the cohort studies and case control studies. So interestingly, the cross-sectional studies can belong to both observational and descriptive studies and analytical studies, because sometimes the cross-sectional studies can have an analytical component. Okay. Another a bit complicated yet a comprehensive classification of medical research taken from an online source. I have acknowledged this source at the bottom of the flow chart, and the medical research can be divided primarily into two categories: the primary research and the secondary research. So what we discussed in the previous slide all comes under primary research. And then what is secondary research? Secondary research is you study the researches done by other people. They exist in researchers. So then in a secondary analysis, so in that regard, you have the meta-analysis and other types of systematic reviews. So meta-analysis means the quantitative part of a systematic review. Then coming back to the primary research, so here these authors have categorized primary research into three categories: basic research, clinical research, and epidemiological research. So basic research is where you do research on basic sciences like anatomy, biochemistry, and physiology or genetic studies. Then the clinical research here, again, like we did in the previous slide, it can be divided into experimental and observational components. So experimental component includes the clinical trials, the phase 1 to phase 4 trials. Then observational studies include the case reports and other case series and secondary data analysis related to clinical research. So the category in red here is the epidemiological research. So under that also we again have the experimental component and the observational component. So under experimental epidemiological research, you get the field studies, right, which we call the intervention studies and the group studies. And for the observational type, you get the cohort studies, which can be prospective cohort studies or historical cohort studies. Then you get the case control studies, the cross-sectional studies, ecological studies, and other types of surveys and surveillance systems, right? So where the study designs or the research designs are concerned, it's really, really important that you understand the hierarchy of evidence. So this illustration was taken from my book on an introduction to systematic reviews in healthcare. And as you can appreciate, the bottom is where the expert opinions and background information lies. Then above that is the case reports and case series. Superior to that is other cross-sectional studies and other observational studies, case control studies and cohort studies. So randomized control studies or trials are obviously more advanced, and on the pinnacle is the systematic reviews we mentioned earlier and meta-analysis. So basically that is because the systematic reviews pools the information or the evidence generated by the primary studies. So that is pooled data, and therefore it carries more weight. So let's understand the research process a little bit. So you start the research by developing the research question, and then you need to do a thorough literature review. So even before developing the research question, you may have to be involved in the literature review. Okay, you need to formulate very smart objectives thereafter, then selection of appropriate study design and methods, collection of data, data processing, data analysis and presentation, interpretation and dissemination of findings. So as you can see, this is a continuous process, and I have put the arrows in yellow because some may prefer to call this the golden thread of the research process, because each component is connected to the next and everything is aligned with the research goals, right? So this is important to keep in mind. So let's understand the research process a little bit more deeply. The stages, the steps and the related activities. I have tabulated all the information here for ease of understanding. And stage 1 would be the introduction. So there's an ongoing activity. I already mentioned that the literature review, we have to start it before even trying to formulate your title and objectives. So it's an ongoing process. You need to be in touch with your literature review throughout the whole process. So it's an ongoing activity. So then identification of problem, analysis of the problem, identification of factors and variables, selection of a researchable topic, writing a statement of the problem and justification are the initial steps. So for that you may need to discuss with your supervisor. Sometimes you may have to hold focus group discussions and seek expert opinions where relevant, and then with the help of your supervisor you will be able to write a tentative topic. Then you need to really get into the literature review. So I have listed it as the second step here as well, because this is the time you really need to review your literature in depth. So you may have to consult the librarian for support if it's necessary. Then it's advisable to maintain a log of all the activities and the literature that you have reviewed. So during, this is the digital era, and you may maintain a reference manager, but you may use a software for that. And we will discuss about that in a future presentation. Then you need to set the objectives, formulation of general objectives and writing the specific objectives. Then operationalization of variables. So at this stage you may finalize the topic and get supervisor's approval on research topic and objectives. So those are the things you need to do in the first stage. Moving on to the second stage, where you develop your methods, study design and methods. And as you can see again, the literature review is going to be an ongoing activity. The steps in the determining the study design and developing the methods. Identify the study design, study population and setting. Determine the sample size and sampling method. Revisit the study variables and design the study instruments. Plan data collection. So for that you need to determine the techniques, who the data collectors are going to be and their training. Then consider the ethical aspects, very important, and plan data processing, analysis and presentation. So what are the related activities? For the initial things we discussed: revisit research methodology lectures, consult your supervisor, statisticians if necessary, translators and experts on the relevant fields. Make a budget and a timeline, because why do we need the translators is that you may formulate your questions or the study instruments, the questionnaires in English, and you may have to translate into the native languages, Sinhalese or Tamil in the case of Sri Lankan situation. And then you need to back translate them into English to see whether everything is in order, whether it has been translated correctly. So therefore you may need the help of translators. Then for the ethical clearance, you need to download the ethical review form, and you need to apply for the ethical clearance certificates. Then in data planning and plan the data processing and analysis and presentation, you may have to prepare dummy tables and choose appropriate statistical methods in the proposal stage. Okay, so once these things have been attended to, you may write the research proposal and submit to relevant departments or board of studies for approval. Then apply for ethical clearance certificate and apply for grants if applicable. Then the third stage would be the project implementation. So here again the ongoing activity would be the literature review. So the steps are administrative clearance. So you may have to send appropriate letters through your supervisor. Select and train data collectors. You may have to have a standard operative manual for everything. Pre-test instruments and pilot your study. And for the data collection, you may need different items. Maybe nowadays people use Google Forms or any other online data collection methods. But if you are going to visit the study setting, then you may need to print your instruments, the study questionnaires if you are using, and you may need other data collection instruments, maybe weighing scales, skin fold measuring calipers and certain things like that. Then data entry, data processing and presentation and analysis. You may need to prepare dummy tables for that and perform appropriate statistical analysis. So for which you need to improve your knowledge on statistical software and tools, and you need to clear your doubts with the statisticians. So the final steps of the project implementation, you need to interpret your data and come to conclusions, Then based on those conclusions, you can make appropriate recommendations. And finally, disseminate the results. So the final outcome of the research process is to write the research report and write the abstract and full text article for publication in journals. So what are the related activities? You need to discuss everything with your supervisor at this stage. And a little bit about the knowledge dissemination. So knowledge dissemination is crucial because that is the mode you use to foster a more informed society, encourage collaboration, and facilitate the practical application of research findings to address real-world health challenges. Okay. Having said that, I'll wind up this session. So before we wind up, in summary, we discussed the evidence-based practice initially, then we defined what medical research is or what clinical research is. Then we discussed the purposes of medical research, and if you can recall, we went on to categorizing the study designs that you can employ in medical research, and lastly we discussed about the research process. I do hope that you have understood the basic principles of medical research through this lecture. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and I will try to respond. Thank you.